A question for you. Who is the MLB's all-time leader in ERA? If you even have a guess, you're better off than I was just a few days ago. And I think that's weird, because so many all-time records are common knowledge. We all know that the NBA's all-time scoring champ is Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, the same way no one's hit more home runs in the MLB than Barry Bonds. Wayne Gretzky has the most points in NHL history by a hilarious margin, and Jack Nicklaus has more major golf titles than anyone else, with 18. Serious fans of any of those sports would be able to tell you that, and even a lot of casual sports fans. But ERA is different. And look, ERA isn't a perfect stat, but no stat is. And when most people want to know how good a pitcher is, ERA is the stat they turn to first. The lowest career ERA in MLB history is 1.82, and it belongs to Ed Walsh. Today, we learn his story. Edward Augustine Walsh was born on May 14, 1881 in Pennsylvania. He was one of 13 children of Irish and Welsh immigrants. As a child, Ed worked in the coal mines. Then at the age of 18, he enrolled at Fordham University, which he attended for precisely 2 days. He met his roommates, decided he didn't like them, and got out of there real quick. Walsh began his baseball career in 1901 and signed his first professional contract with the minor league Wilkes-Barre Barons in 1902. Following the 1903 season, after pitching well for a couple different minor league teams, the Chicago White Sox purchased Walsh's contract for $750. That's about $23,000 in today's money. To this point, Walsh had primarily thrown a fastball and a curveball. However, in spring training in 1904 with the White Sox, teammate Elmer Strickland taught Walsh how to throw the spitball. And while he didn't perfect it immediately, he kept working on it, and by the prime of his career, by his own admission, Walsh threw the pitch 90% of the time. Over his first 2 seasons in the MLB, Walsh pitched well in relatively limited time, making 40 appearances including 21 starts, and going 14-6 with a 2.37 ERA. But 1906 was really the breakout year for the man who was nicknamed Big Ed, which in itself is funny, because he stood 6'1" and weighed 193 pounds, while in 2019, the average MLB pitcher was 6'3", 215. In 1906, Walsh made 41 appearances and 31 starts, going 17-13 with a 1.88 ERA. He helped the White Sox win the AL pennant, setting up a World Series with their crosstown rivals, the Chicago Cubs. The Cubs were huge favorites in the World Series. Their regular season record of 116-36 remains the best winning percentage in Major League Baseball since the turn of the 20th century. Meanwhile, the White Sox were known as the hitless wonders. They finished with the lowest batting average in the whole AL and were guided by their terrific pitching. With the series tied at 1, Walsh made his first start in Game 3, where he threw a 2-hit shutout in a 3-0 victory for the White Sox. He picked up another victory 2 days later in Game 5, and the White Sox won the series in 6 games. The Cubs would go on to win the World Series titles the next 2 seasons. As a brief side note, in 1906, the average World Series game took 2 hours and 1 minute to complete. In 2020, that had ballooned all the way up to 3 hours, 34 minutes. By 1907, Ed Walsh was the White Sox workhorse and widely recognized as one of the best pitchers in the MLB. That year, he went 24-18 with a 1.60 ERA, throwing 422 in a third innings. Those ERA and innings pitched numbers were both good enough to lead the AL. Walsh followed up that campaign in 1908 with his most famous season. Over the course of 66 appearances, including 49 starts, Walsh threw 464 innings. He went 40-15 with an ERA of 1.42 and a whip of .860. This would be the last time that a pitcher won 40 games in a season, and the last time that a pitcher threw at least 400 innings in a season. And again, Walsh was at 464. Today, few pitchers even cracked the 200 innings mark in a season. Walsh led the AL in so many stats in 1908. Innings pitched, complete games, shutouts, strikeouts, etc. But surprisingly, not ERA. That title went to Addie Joss. On October 2nd of that year, Joss and Walsh combined for one of the greatest pitching performances in MLB history. Walsh pitched a complete game four-hitter, allowing just one run. But it wasn't enough, as Addie Joss threw a perfect game in a 1-0 win for the Cleveland Naps. After throwing almost 900 innings in the previous two seasons, Ed Walsh had a reduced workload in 1909, but still managed to go 15-11 with a 1.41 ERA. 1910 marked the opening of White Sox Park, which would later be renamed Comiskey Park. The White Sox would play there for 80 years, and Ed Walsh strongly influenced the park's dimensions, making it pitcher-friendly. That 1910 season was exceptionally weird for Ed Walsh. In fact, originally I wanted to make this episode just on that season. It was arguably his best year in the major leagues. The workhorse was back, as Walsh pitched 369 2/3 innings. He also picked up another ERA title, with the lowest single-season ERA of his career, 1.27. He had a whip of just .820, which is the 14th greatest whip season of all time, and with more innings pitched than anyone else above him on that list. Oh yeah, and he finished with a record of 18-20. 18-20! Like, below 500. It's the lowest ERA of all time for a pitcher with at least 20 starts and a losing record. The White Sox once again had the league's worst batting average at just a paltry .211, and this time it caught up on Walsh's stat sheet. Notably, 3 times he threw complete games in 1-0 losses. My favorite game of the season came on August 4th against the Philadelphia Athletics. That day, Walsh threw 16 shutout innings in a game that was called a 0-0 tie due to darkness. He followed up that performance with 2 complete game shutouts in the next week. Ed Walsh's final 2 years as a dominant pitcher came in 1911 and 1912. Both seasons, he won 27 games, led the AL in innings pitched, and came second in MVP voting. In 1911, he threw a no-hitter and also led the AL in strikeouts. Over the 2 seasons, he had a combined ERA of 2.19. It wrapped up a dominant 7-year stretch for Ed Walsh. Between 1906 and 1912, he threw more than 2,500 innings, going 168 and 112 with a 1.71 ERA. His stats also included 221 complete games and 52 shutouts. But after that, Ed Walsh's arm was done. Once one of the most durable pitchers in MLB history, he pitched fewer than 200 innings total for the rest of his career. Walsh requested the entire 1913 season off to heal his arm, but the White Sox wanted him back, and so back he came. In 1913, he made 16 appearances and 14 starts, going 8-3 with a .258 ERA in 97 2/3 innings pitched. However, he frequently went weeks in between appearances. He said, "My arm would keep me awake till morning with a pain I had never known before." Walsh pitched just 8 times in 1914, 3 times in 1915, and twice in 1916, his final year with the White Sox. Walsh took one final crack at continuing his MLB career in 1917 with the Boston Braves, but made it just 18 innings in 4 appearances. He then went to work in a munitions factory for the rest of World War I and spent a few years in various minor leagues. Following his playing career, he stuck with the game of baseball, becoming an umpire temporarily in 1922, and then joining the White Sox coaching staff for the 1923 and 24 seasons. He later returned to the White Sox in 1928 after his son, Ed Walsh Jr., joined the team after graduating from Notre Dame. The younger Ed Walsh didn't have the same professional success as his father, but in 1933, while playing for the Oakland Oaks of the Pacific Coast League, he did end the 61-game hitting streak of an 18-year-old Joe DiMaggio. That 61-game hitting streak is still the second longest in minor league history, and of course, in his professional career, DiMaggio would later set the record with a 56-game hitting streak. Ed Walsh Sr. was inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1946, and then passed away in 1959 at the age of 78 after contracting cancer. But even all of these years later, Ed Walsh's 1.82 ERA remains the lowest in MLB history. That's pretty darn impressive. And after this, I hope more people will know the name of Ed Walsh. Thanks for listening to this episode of Slept On Sports. I've been Connor Grohl, and until next time, stay sleepin'.